The Wild West is one of the most talked about parts of American history, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. Movies and TV gave us a version full of perfect duels, fearless gunslingers, and nonstop chaos, while the real Old West was usually more complicated and often way more practical. Let's break down 7 Wild West myths people still believe and what the facts actually say. Number 1. High noon duels. The classic picture is 2 men standing in the middle of a dusty street, hands hovering over their holsters, waiting for the clock to strike. It looks clean, fair, and almost organized. Real violence in the Old West rarely worked like that. Most shootings happened fast, at close range, and often with surprise involved, more like a messy argument that turned deadly than a formal duel. A lot of people didn't walk around looking for a showdown because getting shot was very easy and medical care was limited. There's also a big practical point. Many frontier towns tried to prevent gun trouble by restricting firearms inside town limits. Local rules, called ordinances, often required visitors to check their guns with the sheriff, a hotel, or a livery stable, or to keep weapons stored instead of worn openly. Enforcement varied from place to place, but the idea that every town was a constant free-for-all doesn't match how communities actually functioned. Town leaders wanted merchants, rail connections, and steady business, and random gunfire was bad for all of that. Even famous gunfighter moments were the exception, not the daily schedule. When a rare public shootout did happen, it tended to be over in seconds, not minutes, and it usually involved a small number of people, not half the town lining up in a street. Another myth inside the myth is the instant quick draw. Hollywood made speed the whole story. In real life, awareness mattered more. Who saw trouble coming, who had cover, who was sober, and who could keep their hands steady.
Guns also weren't magical, perfectly reliable machines. Many weapons used black powder, which created thick smoke, and misfires were not unheard of. And while revolvers existed, a good one was a serious purchase, so plenty of people used whatever they already had or carried no gun at all when they didn't think they needed one. People also carried different kinds of weapons than the movies suggest. Shotguns and rifles were common tools for guards and lawmen, and they were often more effective than a handgun. Once you drop the idea of constant high-noon duels, the rest of the Wild West starts to look less like an endless action scene and more like real communities trying to survive and make money. You can even see this tension in some of the most famous stories. In Tombstone, Arizona, the gunfight linked to the OK Corral was partly about enforcing a town rule on carrying weapons, and it was over in about half a minute. That kind of event became iconic precisely because it was unusual enough to write about, argue about, and retell for decades. The everyday reality was more routine. People argued, people drank, and sometimes things went wrong, but most days were spent working, trading, and trying not to get in trouble with the local marshal. Order mattered day to day.
Number 2. Cowboys as gunslingers. A cowboy in the late 1800s was usually a working ranch hand, not a roaming gun expert. The job was closer to long-distance outdoor manual labor, moving herds, fixing fences, branding cattle, breaking horses, and spending long stretches in the open with little sleep. A lot of the skill was about control, knowing animals, reading weather, and handling a rope, because a rope was a daily tool in a way a gun wasn't. Most cowboys were paid modest wages, and many were young men who took the work because it was available, not because they were chasing a legend. Some of the most famous cowboy years were tied to the cattle drive era after the Civil War, when herds were pushed north to rail towns so beef could reach eastern markets. That work was exhausting and repetitive, and the biggest danger was often a stampede,
a fall, or exposure to bad weather. The look is also exaggerated. Movie cowboys tend to have spotless hats, fancy gun belts, and the same outfit every day. Real working clothes were about function. Hats, boots, and chaps mattered, but they got worn down, patched, and replaced, and a working cowboy cared more about comfort than style. Another part people still miss is diversity. The cowboy workforce was not all white and not all native-born Americans. A large share were Mexican or Mexican-American, building on older vaquero traditions, and many were black cowboys after the Civil War. There were also native and mixed heritage cowboys and immigrants who found ranch work. The lone white hero image is mostly a later storytelling choice. When you see cowboys as workers first, it also changes how you see cow towns. Many cowboys came to town after a long drive to get paid, rest, and buy supplies. Some did get into fights, but the rowdy night was not the same thing as a life defined by gunplay. Most of the time, a gun was a practical tool for emergencies, not a personality.
The myth survives because it's flashy, but the everyday truth is more grounded. The West ran on labor, not nonstop shootouts. Number 3. A totally lawless frontier. It's easy to think frontier means no rules, but most places had rules quickly because people needed predictability. You can't run a rail station, a mine, a cattle market, or a land office without paperwork and some kind of authority to back it up. The West had sheriffs, town marshals, judges, juries, and federal law enforcement like U.S. Marshals. Some towns even hired extra police or formed temporary posses, groups of citizens asked to help law enforcement when there was an emergency. The real issue wasn't that law didn't exist, it was that enforcement was uneven. Distances were huge, budgets were small, and communication could be slow. That meant a criminal could sometimes get a head start by crossing into another county or territory. But as the telegraph and rail lines spread, it became easier to send descriptions and warrants across long distances, and that slowly tightened the net. Another reality people forget is how much of frontier law was about business. Land titles, mining claims, water rights, livestock brands, and debt. Those disputes might sound boring, but they were central, and they pulled courts and officials into daily life. Corruption also existed. Some officials were competent and brave, others were political, underpaid, or tied to local power groups. Still, most residents pushed for order because investors and families avoided places that felt unstable. Newspapers, churches, schools, and businesses grew fast in many towns, and those institutions usually came with expectations. No firing guns in the street, no stealing livestock, no cheating customers openly. Another Hollywood habit is the one-man lawman who handles everything alone. In reality, lawmen relied on networks, deputies, informants, local leaders, and sometimes private security hired by companies.
They also spent time on unglamorous work, serving papers, collecting taxes, managing jails, and dealing with property disputes. The frontier could be violent, but lawless is too simple. It was more like a patchwork. Some places were rough, some were relatively stable, and many moved back and forth depending on economics, politics, and who happened to be in charge.
Number 4. Outlaws lived on bank robberies.
The popular version of Old West crime is basically a greatest hits playlist. Bank robberies, train robberies, dramatic chases, and criminals who always escape. The reality is that those headline crimes were risky and not as common as people think. Robbing a bank in a small town was dangerous because banks were usually local, meaning the staff and customers might recognize you. Banks also didn't always have huge piles of cash sitting around, and in many areas the biggest money moved through business accounts, livestock, or credit, not stacks of bills. Train robberies had their own problems. Rail companies improved security, express firms moved valuables in locked cars, safes were hard to open quickly, and the crime instantly became a big deal because trains connected powerful businesses and government mail. That brought serious pressure from law enforcement and private detectives. Most criminals who tried high-profile robberies had short careers, not long ones, because every major robbery created witnesses, wanted notices, and a trail of attention that followed them across states and territories. A lot of outlaw money came from quieter crimes: stealing horses, stealing cattle, selling stolen goods, gambling scams, and fraud. Those crimes could be repeated and were harder to track than a bank job that put the whole region on alert. The myth also blurs the line between reality and marketing. Dime novels, newspapers looking for sensation, and later Wild West shows turned specific criminals into larger-than-life characters. Some outlaws became famous partly because their enemies also became famous. Well-known lawmen, powerful railroad companies, or detective agencies that wrote about their own victories. When you strip away the legend, many outlaws look less like masterminds and more like people taking big risks in an economy where desperation, opportunity, and weak oversight sometimes lined up.
That doesn't make them harmless, but it does make the romantic outlaw life seem less realistic. Number 5. Dead or alive meant open season. Wanted posters and the phrase dead or alive sound like a legal permission slip to shoot someone on sight. In practice, it didn't work that way. Rewards were often offered by private parties, railroad companies, banks, insurance groups, or local citizens because they wanted a suspect caught. Posters were also propaganda tools. They spread a name, a face, and a story, and the details could be wrong or outdated. The goal was usually capture and identification, and then a trial, not random killing. Dead or alive could mean the payer would accept either a living suspect or proof that the suspect was truly dead, but that didn't automatically make killing lawful. Law enforcement still had to answer to local courts, politics, and public opinion, and shootings could create their own legal trouble. Also, many bounty hunter stories are mixed up with later history. The modern image of bounty hunters is tied to bail enforcement, people who tracked down defendants who skipped court after posting bail. That system developed more strongly later and looks different from frontier manhunts. In the Old West, the most common way fugitives were chased was through official posses, deputized citizens, U.S. Marshals, local sheriffs, and sometimes private detective agencies hired to recover stolen property or find suspects. Those private agents were real, but they weren't free to do whatever they wanted either. They operated inside and around the law, and they could be blocked by local authorities or attacked by public backlash. There's another quiet truth. Rewards were not always huge. Posters made them look dramatic, but the pay often didn't match the danger and travel costs. That's why many chases were driven by duty, reputation, or employer pressure, not just easy money. When you see dead or alive, it's better to read it as rough frontier wording, not a blank check. Number 6. One story about Native Americans. Native American covers hundreds of nations with different languages, governments, economies, and relationships to the United States and to each other. The Wild West myth often squeezes all of that into one label, either noble or hostile, depending on the story. Real history was far more complex. Some native nations traded with settlers, negotiated, and made alliances.
Some fought to defend land, food sources, and sovereignty. Many did all of those things at different times because circumstances changed. In the 1800s, huge pressures hit indigenous communities. Rapid expansion by the U.S. and other settlers, broken or rewritten treaties, forced removals, disease, loss of hunting grounds, and military campaigns. On the plains, the destruction of the buffalo herds was a major shock to economies that depended on them. In the Southwest and West Coast, conflicts played out differently, tied to missions, mining, railroads, and land seizures. Those pressures produced violence, but it wasn't a simple good guys versus bad guys storyline. It was often about survival in a fast-changing world where one side had growing numbers, industrial supply chains, and federal power behind it. It's also a myth that indigenous life was only small bands moving around with no structure. Many nations had long-established systems of leadership, diplomacy, and law. Some were deeply agricultural, others combined farming, hunting, and trade in seasonal cycles. Even among plains peoples famous for horse culture, daily life involved family, community, and careful management of resources. Another thing that gets erased is how often Native people were part of the West's economy, as scouts, guides, translators, ranch workers, traders, and sometimes soldiers, often in difficult, controversial roles.
If you want a clearer picture, the key is to stop treating Native Americans as one character in a movie and start seeing specific nations facing specific pressures in specific places. Number 7. Saloons with a whole West. The saloon is the most recognizable Old West set. Swinging doors, a bar, card games, and constant whiskey. Saloons did exist, and some were rough, but the myth comes from treating them as the center of everything. Many towns had multiple types of social spaces: boarding houses, cafes, dance halls, theaters, churches, lodges, sports clubs, and community halls. Frontier towns also had boring but important places: general stores, blacksmith shops, stables, barber shops, newspapers, and schools. Families lived in Western towns, not just single men. Women worked as business owners, teachers, journalists, doctors, and activists, even when the culture tried to limit them. And alcohol itself is often simplified. Hard liquor was common in some places, but beer and other drinks were also widely consumed, and drinking patterns depended on region, ethnicity, and local rules. Some saloons tried to look respectable to attract steady customers, while others were designed for gambling and fast cash. Some towns tried to control alcohol through licenses, curfews, or bans, while others relied on saloons for tax revenue and tolerated them. The swinging doors detail is also more of a movie habit. Many real saloons had ordinary entrances and layouts that changed with the building. What really explains the saloon myth is media. Late 1800s dime novels, traveling Wild West shows, and early movies focused on the most visual, dramatic parts of frontier life, because that's what sold tickets. The everyday West, work, family, local politics, money, and infrastructure, doesn't look as exciting on a poster. But it's the everyday part that made the region function and eventually turned a lot of frontier areas into stable states with cities, laws, and modern industries.